Tonight we venture into a world where international diplomacy doesn't always involve stern men in suits, secret treaties, or missile tests. No, sometimes it's about a fluffy creature with round black eyes, an unimpressed expression, and an endless appetite for bamboo. Picture it now: you're standing in front of a government building, maybe in Washington or London or Tokyo, but instead of a motorcade, the crowd is waiting for a FedEx plane carrying two furry celebrities. Giant pandas. It sounds adorable, and it is, but beneath the black and white fuzz is a decades-long story of strategy, symbolism, and strangely binding agreements. And fair warning, if you accidentally say the wrong thing to the wrong country, you might just get your panda deal cancelled. Yes, you probably wouldn't survive panda diplomacy in the real world, not without a law degree, some foreign policy training, and the ability to smile while negotiating a clause about cub custody. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far this sleepy little history channel reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all began with a gift. Not just any gift, but a creature so rare and beloved in its native China that it was almost mythical to foreign eyes. In 1941, as World War II raged across continents, a peculiar diplomatic gesture occurred. Madame Chiang Kai-shek, First Lady of the Republic of China, decided to send two giant pandas, Pandi and Panda, to the United States. They were housed at the Bronx Zoo and drew 500,000 visitors in their first month. You can imagine the lines, New Yorkers in their best hats and trench coats dragging their children through a city mid-blackout just to glimpse the sleepy bears sprawled on a log. It wasn't just a cute spectacle, it was a statement: we trust you enough to send you our national treasure. Because let's be clear, back then pandas weren't just animals, they were quiet emblems of China's natural heritage, seen only rarely even by locals. But this early act of panda gifting was not just about goodwill, it was strategic. China needed allies, especially powerful ones like the United States, to help resist Japanese occupation. And if that meant putting two round-eared emissaries on a ship across the Pacific, so be it. The US public understandably went wild. After all, this was the same era when circus elephants still paraded down Broadway and radio announcers made animals seem like dignitaries. The panda was not just a bear, it was the foreign policy version of a Broadway debut. But as endearing as those first two pandas were, they wouldn't live long. One died in 1946, the other in 1947, possibly due to the poor understanding of panda biology at the time. Keepers fed them diets meant for other bears too much fruit, not enough bamboo, too little knowledge. Still, the precedent had been set. When China gave you a panda, it meant something. Decades passed and China changed hands. After the Chinese Civil War, Mao Zedong's communist government took power in 1949. For a while, relations between China and the Western world were frosty, to say the least. But then came a thaw, and with it a second wave of panda diplomacy. Fast forward to 1972, Nixon visits China. It's a moment that reshaped Cold War dynamics. There were formal dinners, symbolic toasts, and behind-the-scenes gifts. The US brought musk oxen, China brought pandas. Which gift do you think won the popularity contest? Two pandas, Ling Ling and Xing Xing, were sent to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. as a direct result of that visit. And within days of their arrival, they became national celebrities. Children sent letters, news anchors gave daily updates. Even the zookeepers needed media training. Meanwhile, in the background, serious diplomatic gears were turning. Because the pandas were not just here to amuse, they were the softest of soft power wrapped in fur and mystery. And just to clarify how powerful that gesture was, when the UK restored diplomatic relations with China in 1974, guess what showed up at the London Zoo? Yep, a panda. In fact, between 1957 and 1983, China gave away 24 pandas to 9 countries. And always after a major diplomatic event, you could chart global relationships on a fuzzy black and white map, with each panda placement marking a warming alliance or mended fence. Yet not all historians agree on the intent. Some argue it was simply a cultural gesture, others insist it was a calculated form of soft power unique to post-revolutionary China. But one thing's certain, pandas got people talking, and more importantly, they got people listening. Of course there were critics. Even back then, some questioned whether moving endangered animals around the globe was wise or humane. But you'd be surprised how little that mattered when a nation's leader was trying to cozy up to China. Suddenly conservation was a footnote and bamboo shipments were classified cargo. Remember, this was before any formal panda rental system. These were gifts, and that's what made them so potent. A panda was not a trade deal, it was a symbol of trust, prestige, and a diplomatic relationship just beginning to thaw. So imagine yourself in that time. You're an ambassador, fresh off a handshake photo op, your tie askew, and your cheeks sore from forced smiles. Your job isn't done until you hear the quiet word, they've approved the pandas. Only then can you go back to your hotel, loosen your collar, and order room service with the smug satisfaction of someone who just scored the world's most charismatic bear. You wake up one morning in 1984 and the pandas are no longer gifts. No more red ribbon-wrapped crates rolling off planes like oversized plushies at the end of state visits. Instead, now they come with paperwork. Long paperwork. Legal contracts longer than some Cold War peace treaties. Why? Because China had changed the rules. Gone were the days of fuzzy goodwill gestures. Now, panda diplomacy had a price tag. After decades of gifting pandas as living symbols of friendship, Beijing decided it was time to monetize the fluff. That year, it began offering pandas strictly on 10-year loans with annual fees of up to $1 million. Zoos from Washington to Vienna had to reckon with an awkward reality. Those black and white bundles of joy were now official rented assets. This shift wasn't just about money, though it certainly helped fund panda conservation programs back home. It was also about control of narrative, of image, and of cubs. You see, even if a baby panda was born abroad, the new contracts made it clear that little furball still belonged to China. Always. Without exception. Born in Atlanta, still Chinese. Raised in Madrid, still Chinese. And eventually always shipped back before age 4, like clockwork. If this sounds possessive, well, it is. But it's also strategic, because pandas had become tools in a wider arsenal of soft power, and no one guards their tools like a state that understands the currency of cuteness. Historians still argue whether this policy shift was purely bureaucratic or a masterstroke of diplomatic rebranding. Some say the policy reflected China's growing confidence on the world stage. Others point to a rising nationalist current within China's political leadership, a determination to reassert sovereignty even over cuddly ambassadors. Either way, the old system was dead. No more panda gifts. Now it was business, and you standing in the rain outside a zoo in Berlin or Toronto would probably never notice the difference. You'd be too busy marveling at the creature behind the glass, bunching on bamboo with the slow serenity of a yoga master who's just discovered room service. But backstage, that panda's presence had taken years of negotiation, environmental audits, promises about enclosures, and even contingency plans in case of a government collapse. Seriously, every panda lease has a clause about repatriation in case of political upheaval, just in case someone decides to suddenly swap out democracy for dictatorship. Well, China gets the panda back first. That's how specific the terms had become. And the implications weren't lost on diplomats. From the outside, it looked like a cultural exchange. On paper, it was an international rental agreement more complex than some airline mergers. One of the most contentious clauses, aside from the cub ownership, was the conservation fee. This was the $1 million annual cost officially justified as money sent back to support breeding programs and habitat preservation in Sichuan. In practice, though, many saw it as a diplomatic toll gate. If you wanted a panda, you had to pay, and not just in cash. You also had to behave. Because panda loans were never just about money, they were a trust test. Zoos that wanted pandas had to prove their commitment to China's conservation goals, yes, but also subtly their alignment with China's broader diplomatic expectations. Say the wrong thing about Tibet or Taiwan, and suddenly your panda request could be under review. Leak a memo about a trade dispute, and your application might just vanish into bureaucratic limbo. There are unconfirmed stories, fringe tales whispered among retired Foreign Service officers about Panda offers being revoked mid-negotiation over things as minor as a UN vote or an offhand quote in a newspaper. Of course, Beijing never admits this officially. They'll say a habitat wasn't up to code, that the application lacked adequate funding, that the requested enclosure didn't match the species' needs. But behind closed doors, you don't need a translator to understand what a denied panda means. And trust me, every embassy gets the message loud and clear. Still, despite the steep costs and complex politics, zoos across the world lined up for a chance. Because pandas draw crowds. Not just kids and families, but donors, sponsors, and media attention. A new panda exhibit meant spikes in ticket sales, merch revenue, and philanthropic endowments. In short, a panda was a furry goldmine. Some zoos even rebranded entire sections around their new guests, installing bamboo gardens, Chinese lanterns, and panda-themed cafes, serving overpriced bio buns to tourists too giddy to complain. But beneath the marketing glitter was a quiet pressure to keep the Chinese partners happy. Some zookeepers in anonymous interviews admitted they felt like ambassadors themselves, more concerned with diplomatic etiquette than veterinary routines. There were rules about who could access the pandas, how much data to share with China, and when media could be invited for photos. Even naming the pandas had to be approved by Chinese officials. If you wanted to name your panda after a beloved national hero, nope. It better be something culturally appropriate, or at the very least something that didn't cause diplomatic side-eyes. One zoo in the early 2000s even had its panda naming contest nullified after voters picked a cheeky pop culture reference. China objected. The contest was reset. Democracy deferred. And so the panda remained unnamed until both sides agreed on something safe. You can almost picture the poor zookeeper trying to explain this to a room full of disappointed third graders. No, we can't name it Panda McPandaface. It's complicated, and complicated it was, because once you rented a panda, you weren't just housing a bear, you were hosting a miniature embassy. Every visit by a Chinese delegate to inspect the enclosure, every holiday celebration featuring dumplings and calligraphy, every baby panda birth streamed live to millions. It all became a stage for diplomacy. A black and white slow-motion pageant of trust. And the stakes, sometimes they were enormous. Just ask any country that lost a panda during a rough political patch. The absence was louder than any statement. Silence in the bamboo became a message of disapproval, and everyone knew it. Now picture this, it's the 1980s, you're sitting in a smoky Cold War-era embassy office somewhere between the ashtray and the fax machine, watching a news broadcast announcing that China just approved a panda lease to your geopolitical rival, and your own country's application still pending review. You'd feel it immediately, not just the diplomatic slight, but the ripple effect it would cause back home. That's how potent panda diplomacy had become. During the Cold War, when nuclear missiles and spy satellites dominated the headlines, the quiet shuffle of pandas across international borders told a different story, a story of subtle alignment, reward, or strategic silence. When a panda appeared in a country, especially a Western one, it usually meant relations with China had just taken a friendly turn. But when the panda stopped coming, or was even taken back, it could be a warning. Just ask the Soviet Union. Despite being China's communist neighbor and ideological cousin, it didn't receive any pandas during the height of the Cold War. Not one. Their diplomatic falling out in the 1960s spilled over into everything, including bear distribution. Historians still argue whether the panda freeze-out was symbolic or simply bureaucratic, but the result, a clear, fuzzy void where Soviet pandas should have been. You didn't need a joint statement to notice that. In contrast, when the United States received its panda pair in 1972, just after Nixon's visit to Beijing, the message was deafening in its silence. At a time when most forms of US-China communication were heavily restricted, a panda lease was as good as a red carpet invitation. Better even, because unlike an ambassador, a panda didn't speak. It didn't contradict anyone. It didn't defect. And yet it told the world everything it needed to know. Of course, not every panda move was that obvious. Some placements were subtle tests of trust, an early olive branch maybe, or a low-stakes indicator of diplomatic thaw. When Canada received a panda in 1985, it wasn't just because of maple leaves and politeness. It was a carefully timed move that followed years of China-Canada economic overtures. The panda was the handshake you couldn't misinterpret, the smiling guest who never stirred up controversy, unless they bit a keeper or refused to mate on live camera, which happened frequently. You see, panda behavior often became symbolic too. If the pandas didn't breed, whispers of bad omen would circulate, half joking, half not. If a cub died unexpectedly, tabloids speculated about curses, cultural disrespect, or mishandled bamboo shipments. And when pandas did have cubs, the headlines, front pages, interviews, extended zoo hours. A panda birth in a Cold War capital could feel like a diplomatic baby shower. It wasn't always light-hearted. During particularly tense periods between China and the West, say after arms sales to Taiwan, or public criticism of China's internal policies, zoo officials would sometimes find themselves caught in awkward silence. One keeper in the early 90s reportedly received a curt email about cultural performance obligations being delayed, which everyone understood to mean Beijing's "not happy, don't throw the panda party yet." This kind of passive-aggressive scheduling became standard in the art of panda signaling, and the pressure wasn't just international. Domestic politics was sometimes tangled into panda arrangements too. Local governments often fought for hosting rights mayors, vying to be the one who brought pandas to their cities, promising new enclosures and partnerships with Chinese conservation groups. It was municipal pride on display with bears as the centerpiece. One American mayor even promised bamboo-themed public transit upgrades as part of a panda pitch. Spoiler, the pandas came, but the trains stayed the same. Meanwhile, zoo PR teams sharpened their messaging. They learned to walk a fine line celebrating the pandas without stepping on diplomatic toes. If a panda slept too much, it was meditative. If a panda refused to mate, it was choosy. If a panda had a meltdown and tore up an enrichment toy expressing natural instincts. Always spin, never scandal. Yet the truth remained, pandas were not just bears. They were barometers of who stood where, of who behaved how. Even Western allies of the US noticed the pattern. The UK's pandas arrived soon after Prime Minister Edward Heath visited China. France got theirs post-de Gaulle détente, and each instance was celebrated with quiet satisfaction. A bear was worth more than 1,000 communiques, but perhaps the most telling contrast during this period was between nations that received pandas and those that didn't. India, for example, so close to China, geographically, yet so frequently at odds, politically, never got pandas. They tried. Oh, they tried. But border tensions and nationalist rhetoric kept the cages empty. Some Indian politicians even joked bitterly that China would sooner send a dragon than a panda. Japan, meanwhile, had its own tangled panda timeline. While Ueno Zoo in Tokyo hosted pandas as early as 1972, every new lease after that came with media scrutiny and government-level correspondence. Pandas were not rented lightly. They were contracts soaked in history. And so the Cold War marched on, missiles in the headlines and pandas in the margins. But in those margins lived the real clues. Because while spies traded secrets and leaders exchanged threats, pandas quietly charted a different course, a secondary map of global trust. Not everyone got a panda. Not everyone deserved one. That's what made it such a potent symbol. And that's what made the stakes so strangely high for what was, after all, just an animal that slept 18 hours a day. Still, that sleepy gaze, that slow blink from behind a bamboo stalk, told a story no ambassador could match. It said, "We see you, we trust you, for now." And in the anxious dance of global politics, that for now was sometimes enough to keep the peace. You stand behind the glass at a zoo, watching a panda casually tumble backward off a log and land on its back like an overfed baby monk. Everyone around you coos. But what you don't see, buried beneath the softness and slapstick, is a clause in a contract thicker than most city ordinances, a clause that dictates exactly what happens when that panda has a cub. And, spoiler alert, it doesn't stay here. Because under every panda lease, since the 1980s, is a rule so specific, so awkwardly emotional, it has caused tears, protests, and diplomatic headaches. All baby pandas born abroad belong to China. No exceptions. Not even if they're born in your zoo, raised by your staff and doted on by your nation's toddlers from the moment they open their googly eyes. You might think that seems unfair until you remember how high the stakes are. Because to China, pandas are not just bears, they are state property officially classified under national treasures. You wouldn't expect the Louvre to let you keep the Mona Lisa if she had a baby in your living room. Same logic, sort of. Still, it catches people off guard. A new panda cub is celebrated with such fanfare contests to name it breathless, local media commemorative coins that it feels cruel to watch it shipped back to Chengdu after only a few short years. Sometimes entire schools write letters begging the zoo to keep the baby. And each time the answer is the same: no, not yours. Now, the reasoning isn't entirely about control, even though yes, there's plenty of that too. China argues that bringing cubs back helps with genetic diversity, centralized medical care, and long-term conservation. After all, breeding pandas isn't like breeding rabbits. It's notoriously difficult. Female pandas are fertile for only 2 or 3 days a year. 2 or 3. Let that sink in. Zookeepers have described the window as a romantic panic. You've got one shot, maybe two, to get 2 mostly disinterested sleepy bears to fall in love in front of a room full of cameras. That's pressure. So when a cub is born, it's a mini miracle, and China wants that miracle repatriated. That's why every lease includes a return clause typically set for the cub's 4th birthday. Why 4? Because at that age they're weaned, mobile, and let's be honest, less adorable, which makes the goodbye parties feel extra bittersweet. Balloons goodbye, cakes, zoo directors choking up on the mic, children clutching farewell drawings taped to the enclosure glass. Meanwhile, the panda, blissfully unaware, it's thinking about snacks. But what happens next is less sentimental. The cub is carefully sedated, secured in a temperature-controlled crate, and flown across continents with more security than most diplomats. It lands in China to fanfare and headlines. And then it joins one of the government's breeding centers, either in Chengdu or Wolong, where it enters a new chapter of life under state-supervised care. There it may one day become a breeder itself, or a kind of panda ambassador in training, but it will never return to the zoo where it was born. Some Western critics have called this custody arrangement exploitative, arguing that if the host zoo does the hard work of breeding and raising a panda, it should at least have partial claim. But the Chinese government doesn't budge. Historians still debate whether the rigidity is about ecological planning or geopolitical leverage. One theory: by keeping all panda cubs Chinese, the country maintains long-term symbolic control over every panda abroad. No matter how westernized the enclosure, how foreign the bamboo, that panda still belongs to the Middle Kingdom. Even more intriguing are the legal gymnastics required to enforce this policy. Zoos have to submit regular health reports, breeding plans, and behavior logs back to China, some even daily. If a panda is diagnosed with a health issue, Chinese experts are flown in or consulted by video call. Veterinary teams have described being co-managed by Chinese counterparts, sometimes leading to awkward situations where local staff must pause treatments until Beijing gives approval. Imagine calling a foreign capital to ask permission to sedate a bear with an upset stomach. Welcome to Panda Diplomacy. But perhaps the most tender moment in all of this process is the naming. You'd think naming a panda cub would be straightforward. It's not. Under modern rules, the host country may suggest names, often opening it to public vote. But the final name must be approved by Chinese officials. No puns, no celebrity tributes, nothing inappropriate, a term interpreted broadly. One French zoo once proposed naming their cub after a famous author. Rejected. Another zoo tried to go with a local folk hero. Denied. In the end, most names end up referencing peace, friendship, or bamboo, which is fine, sure, but it tends to dampen the creativity. Even still, some panda cubs grow into global celebrities. Meixiang's cub Xiaoqi, born in the US in 2020 during the pandemic, became a beacon of joy in a dark year. People tuned in to live streams. Teachers added panda facts to online lesson plans. The zoo's website crashed under the traffic. And yet, even as he grew up under the stars and stripes, everyone knew the clock was ticking. His suitcase, metaphorically, was always packed. Some fans feel betrayed when the time comes. Social media fills with teary tributes and hashtags like, "Oh, don't take our bear." But others accept it for what it is, a kind of temporary custody in the name of peace. And really, that's the strange genius of it. Because by reclaiming each cub, China resets the diplomatic clock. If you want another panda, well, let's talk. It's hard to imagine any other animal arrangement being this emotionally fraught, let alone this politically layered. You never hear about otter diplomacy or penguin consulates. But with pandas, every cub's birth is a reminder of the temporary transactional nature of the relationship. And every farewell is a negotiation disguised as a goodbye. So the next time you're at the zoo and you see a chubby panda cub yawning beside its mother, remember that little guy isn't just adorable. It's a passport, a deadline, a symbol of something much bigger than itself. The crate touches down. There's a ripple of applause, cameras clicking, and suddenly you're in the middle of something that looks like a red carpet event, but for an animal that mostly naps and chews on fibrous snacks. The panda has arrived. But not just quietly, not in the hush of quarantine or the stillness of a backdoor delivery. No, this is a ceremony, a diplomatic theatre of the absurd and the adorable. There are flower bouquets, kids in panda costumes, flag-waving dignitaries, and sometimes even folk dancers performing in front of bewildered cargo handlers. Because when a panda comes to town, the whole city is expected to show it. You can practically hear the zoo director rehearsing their lines. It's not just a bear, it's a bridge. And while that line might make a sleepy fourth grader roll their eyes, the grown-ups understand the weight of it. Panda arrival ceremonies have become full-on productions. The panda steps or is wheeled off the plane to a crowd more enthusiastic than most political rallies. Sometimes a red carpet is literally unrolled. In Germany, when two pandas arrived in 2017, Chancellor Angela Merkel and Chinese President Xi Jinping both attended the welcome at Berlin Zoo. Think about that for a second, two of the world's most powerful leaders pausing national security briefings to stand near a crate of jet-lagged mammals. That's the level we're talking about. Even more surreal, the panda doesn't care. It's sleepy, jet-lagged, confused. It has no idea it just participated in a geopolitical performance. It's sniffing the air, maybe grunting softly, while a children's choir sings something vaguely panda-themed in the background. Meanwhile, reporters are shoving microphones into the faces of scientists and politicians alike, all of whom say variations of the same thing. This marks a new chapter of friendship. The phrase becomes wallpaper. You stop noticing it. But the pandas, silent and slow, speak louder. Behind all the performance is a deeply choreographed process. Before a panda even sets paw in a new country, months, sometimes years of negotiations unfold. Veterinary teams from the host zoo fly to China to train with their future guests. They study dietary preferences, grooming rituals, mating quirks. The pandas are acclimated to specific scents, sometimes even exposed to recordings of the host country's ambient sounds, things like traffic, unfamiliar bird calls, or human chatter in a different language. It's less like preparing for an animal transfer and more like onboarding a very picky diplomat. And then there's the bamboo. Oh, the bamboo. One panda can eat up to 40 pounds of bamboo a day, and it can't be just any bamboo. It must be fresh, properly sourced, preferably grown without pesticides, and delivered like clockwork. Some zoos try to grow their own. Others import it weekly, creating bizarre supply chains for leafy stalks more pampered than most luxury goods. One zoo in Scotland even faced a temporary crisis when storms disrupted their bamboo shipments. Emergency flights were considered, all this for snacks. But the stakes are worth it. For the host zoo, a panda is a guaranteed attraction. Ticket sales spike. Gift shop merchandise expands overnight to include panda plushies, panda mugs, panda hoodies, panda-themed chocolate bars. Even toilet paper gets rebranded. One American zoo reported a doubling of revenue after receiving its panda pair. And it's not just the kids dragging their parents to the zoo anymore. Adults come too nostalgic curious or just enchanted by the rare chance to see what's become a living icon of diplomacy. This popularity feeds into another layer of the spectacle VIP panda tours. Behind-the-scenes access to panda enclosures becomes a golden ticket often given to visiting foreign dignitaries, high-level sponsors, or powerful business partners. Some zoos quietly auction private panda encounters as fundraisers which, though wildly expensive, often sell out. And who wouldn't want a selfie beside a lounging panda? Just don't try to hug it. That's a fast track to getting escorted out, or worse, bitten. Historians still argue whether these pageants serve a purpose beyond optics. Some say the spectacle cheapens conservation. Others claim it's part of a broader strategy using pandas to create shared public moments that soften public opinion toward China. After all, it's hard to be angry at a government that sends you baby bears. But others remain skeptical. They see the pageantry as a velvet curtain, one that hides the more serious strategic objectives backstage. Still, the rituals persist. Panda birthdays are celebrated with ice cakes shaped like bamboo. Their New Year's celebrations are filmed and posted by embassies. Zoos create newsletters written in the voice of the panda, addressing kids directly. Entire educational programs are built around them. School children write essays about panda dreams. Diplomats smile through rehearsed speeches about mutual trust. And everyone, yes, even you, starts to believe just a little in the story being told. Because panda ceremonies aren't just about China's relationship with the host country, they're also about you, the observer. You are meant to witness this moment, to internalize the message that diplomacy can be soft, that alliances can be furry, that trust can wear a black and white coat and still carry centuries of nuance. But even within all this carefully choreographed optimism, awkward moments sneak in. Once a panda sneezed so loudly during a press conference that the interpreter paused mid-sentence. Another time during a photo op, one panda turned its back to the dignitaries and defecated. Live on camera, you can imagine the PR scramble. It's a blessing, joked one zoo director nervously, a kind of natural blessing. Smooth, yet maybe that's the beauty of it. Amid all the scripts and symbolism, the pandas do what they've always done, be themselves. Oblivious, uncooperative, lovable. They nap, they roll, they break things. They remind everyone, politician, scientist, child, that no matter how layered the meaning a panda is, still just a panda. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. Me. You're walking through a zoo popcorn in one hand, map in the other, trying to find the panda exhibit. But this isn't just a casual stroll through some sleepy wildlife park. It's more like entering a national theatre, because somewhere along the way, the panda enclosure has become the zoo's version of the United Nations General Assembly, minus the simultaneous translators and the bad coffee. Whether in Washington, Edinburgh, or Vienna, the moment a panda arrives, the zoo itself transforms into a political stage, and everyone in the production, curators, keepers, and even volunteers knows that they are suddenly performing for more than just children on field trips. Here's the truth. No one tells you during the Panda Cam livestream. Once you house a panda, you are in the diplomacy business. You're not just a zookeeper, you're an unofficial cultural liaison, because every panda exhibit is now viewed through a geopolitical lens. Each enclosure becomes a litmus test for bilateral relations. The panda's arrival date, its care, the ceremony of its birthday, and even the phrasing on signage is studied by diplomats and discussed behind closed embassy doors. One misstep, like mispronouncing a Chinese name or using the wrong map on an educational display in your panda partnership, may feel a sudden chill. The deeper irony, this all happens at a zoo, the same place where kids scream about flamingos and beg for Dippin' Dots. Yet right here, tucked among the meerkats and lemurs, is a diplomatic outpost that says as much about international alliances as any official embassy. It's soft power in its coziest disguise. And zoos, especially in the West, have leaned into this role with enthusiasm and occasionally deep anxiety. In some cases, zoos have invested tens of millions into panda-specific infrastructure. One American zoo spent over $30 million upgrading its facilities just to meet China's standards for hosting the animals. They didn't just build an enclosure. They built a temple complete with feng shui consultations, specially commissioned murals and temperature control systems so precise they could make an orchid blush. Local news stations covered the construction like it was the Olympic Village. People watched the panda wing rise like an altar to cross-cultural cooperation. Of course, this new role comes with immense scrutiny. Every aspect of panda life becomes public fodder. The media begins reporting on a panda's sleeping patterns, favorite treats, even poop consistency, like it's the Dow Jones Index. One panda in Thailand had a camera crew stationed outside its enclosure for weeks in anticipation of a possible mating attempt. They brought in panda specialists from Chengdu. They studied hormone levels like stock traders watching a volatile market. And when the mating failed because the male panda was unmotivated, national disappointment followed. TV anchors sighed, social media moaned, and somewhere in the background, China took notes. Historians still debate whether this kind of attention does more harm than good. Some say the heightened focus helps raise awareness for endangered species. Others argue it turns conservation into performance art. Either way, what's clear is that the panda alone among zoo animals generates expectations that are both biological and political. That expectation extends to the people who work with them. Panda handlers often receive months of specialized training and in some cases are required to participate in cross-cultural workshops. One zookeeper in Europe described feeling like they were working not just under veterinary supervision, but under diplomatic surveillance. Every interaction with the panda was logged. Every health report had to be formatted for translation. Even enrichment toys needed to be pre-approved. You want to give your panda a puzzle box shaped like a British flag. Better run that up the flagpole first. Even small moments like choosing which dignitary gets to feed the panda a carrot for a photo can become an exercise in protocol. There are unspoken rules. A lower-level delegate might be allowed a glimpse from behind the glass, but to hand-feed the panda, that privilege is reserved for ministers, ambassadors, or visiting heads of state. And don't even think about selfies. The panda does not do selfies. But what happens when a country's political behavior shifts after a panda has already arrived? That's when things get icy. Take the case of a European country that began criticizing China over human rights issues. The response: their pandas, once front and center, were now subject to sudden changes in visitation policy. Educational programs were quietly restructured. The panda naming event was delayed. Eventually, discussions about lease renewal were paused. No statement was made, but the message was received loud and clear. The bears weren't going anywhere, but they weren't celebrating Lunar New Year either. And yet, for all this tension, people still line up to see the pandas. On weekends, the queue snakes around the enclosure families, patiently waiting for that one golden moment when the panda decides to roll or sneeze or hiccup adorably. They don't see the international chess game playing out behind the exhibit glass. They just see wonder. Soft, slow, and hypnotic wonder. And that perhaps is what keeps this theater alive. Because in an increasingly loud and chaotic world, the panda offers something else. It offers stillness, neutrality, a non-verbal hello from a rising global power wrapped in fur. It doesn't lecture, it doesn't threaten. It just exists, chewing bamboo, draped over a rock, seemingly unaware that it's a living metaphor. And sometimes that's enough. Still, when the cameras turn off and the zoo gates close, the people behind the scenes go back to their binders, their performance reviews, their quiet correspondence with Chinese liaisons, because they know the truth. The panda may look like a passive prop in a zoo play, but it's also a cipher, a black and white creature representing the thousands of shades in between. You're reading a newspaper in the 1980s, sipping weak coffee in a suburban diner when the front page makes you blink. Is Ling Ling expecting right? Next to headlines about global markets and presidential scandals sits a panda ultrasound image. Welcome to the golden age of Panda Watch, when panda pregnancies became full-blown media events and every yawn or sneeze sparked nationwide speculation. If the panda scratched its ear, a reporter would whisper, "Was that a maternal instinct?" If she climbed a tree-nesting behavior, you'd think they were decoding a Cold War cipher, not watching a bear try to nap in peace. It all started because panda reproduction is such a rare event that even the possibility of a cub sends shockwaves. A single confirmed pregnancy could boost zoo attendance by tens of thousands. People drove hours just for the chance to stand beside a velvet rope peering into a dim enclosure praying for the panda to blink. And when it did pandemonium, yes, people actually said that. A lot. In fact, panda pregnancy became its own kind of soap opera, complete with false alarms, hormonal cliffhangers, and surprise twist endings. Because here's the thing about pandas, they're experts at faking it. Pseudo-pregnancy is common. A panda will exhibit all the signs: reduced appetite, mood swings, even hormonal changes, only for zookeepers to realize weeks later, nope, false alarm, she just wanted a break. Same girl, same. Zoo vets, hoping not to disappoint the hopeful masses, often walk a tightrope. They cautiously announce that a panda may be pregnant, and the public runs with it like it's already twins. Local news runs countdowns. Children send name suggestions. Radio hosts debate whether the cub should be named after a national hero or a snack food. The hype becomes self-sustaining. Historians still argue whether this phenomenon helped or hindered actual conservation efforts. Some say it engaged the public in endangered species awareness. Others claim it turned serious science into sensationalized fluff. Still, Panda Watch became a thing. People tuned in like it was a royal wedding. One famous case, the birth of Tai Shan in Washington, D.C. in 2005. The National Zoo's website crashed from traffic. A live panda cam became the office background of millions. Tai Shan's naming contest drew over 200,000 votes. And when he finally emerged pink and squeaky, the world collectively exhaled. Even the first few weeks post-birth are intense. Panda cubs are born tiny, like stick of butter tiny, and completely helpless. They resemble, to be honest, furless baby rats more than the roly-poly bears we expect. But still people obsess. They track the cub's weight. They debate which parent it looks like. They analyze its squeaks like they're learning a second language. And every milestone, a crawl, a sneeze, a successful bottle feeding becomes headline-worthy. Some zookeepers even develop cult followings. The panda midwives, the whisperers, the cub doulas. One woman in Chengdu reportedly received marriage proposals after helping a cub survive a tough first month. Another American keeper had a blog so popular that people mailed in cookies, sweaters, and weirdly specific bamboo-themed fan art. You can't make this stuff up. But what's behind all this obsession? It's more than cuteness. Pandas symbolize hope, real tangible hope, in an often cynical world. They're living proof that diplomacy can create miracles, that decades of tense negotiations, multi-million-dollar leases, and strict environmental protocols can result in one perfect squeak from a cub that shouldn't have survived. Of course, not every story ends happily. Some panda pregnancies end in tragedy, stillbirths, health complications, the heartbreak of a cub dying in its sleep just weeks in. And when that happens, it's not just the zookeepers who grieve, the entire public mourns. Candles appear at zoo gates, children's drawings taped to fences. One zoo even held a memorial vigil with bamboo wreaths and paper lanterns. In those moments, the line between animal and symbol becomes heartbreakingly thin. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Chinese officials monitor everything. Birth announcements must be carefully worded, medical records are shared instantly, and the clock starts ticking toward the cub's return to China. It's a countdown everyone tries not to think about, but it's always there. Lingering. Sometimes, though, panda births become national celebrations. A diplomatic we did it that transcends borders. In 2021, when a panda gave birth in Tokyo, during the pandemic, it was front-page news for days. People called it a sign of recovery, a symbol of life. And honestly, they weren't wrong. In a world that felt fractured, the squeal of a newborn cub somehow stitched a bit of joy back into the air. Yet, even amid the joy, the absurdities continued. panda cubs have been given press passes. They've been named honorary citizens. One even received a tiny passport for its farewell flight. Yes, really? It had its photo and everything. You can almost hear the customs officer asking purpose of travel and the cub responding with a sneeze. Still, every Panda Watch cycle ends the same way the cub grows. The news coverage fades and the keepers start preparing for the bittersweet goodbye. But while the public may move on, the impact remains. That cub will be remembered in photo albums, in school projects, in the soft eyes of 1,000 children who came to believe that the world was, if only for a moment, gentle. And that's the magic of Panda Watch. Beneath the spectacle, beneath the hashtags and baby blankets lies a quiet truth in watching pandas we watched ourselves. Our hope, our need for softness, our belief that diplomacy can sometimes wear a fuzzy coat and hiccup on live TV. You sit down at a diplomatic dinner, the kind where nothing is technically negotiated but where everything gets decided. The soup is lukewarm, the smiles are tight, and the air is heavy with polite tension. The ambassador from your country makes a well-rehearsed toast. Then with a grin that's almost too wide, the Chinese delegate leans in and says, "By the way, we're reconsidering your panda loan." You blink. Fork halfway to your mouth. You try to smile, but you already know this isn't about pandas. This is about something else entirely. Because here's the truth most people miss. Panda loans have always doubled as loyalty tests. They are not offered simply for being friendly. They are offered for being aligned. And when alignment wavers through a vote at the United Nations, a statement about Taiwan, or even a sudden military contract with the wrong party, panda discussions dry up. Or worse, they reverse. Ask Norway. In 2010, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo. A courageous moment. But Beijing was furious. Trade relations froze, political meetings stalled. And when Norwegian officials quietly inquired about future panda cooperation, they got the diplomatic equivalent of a slammed door. For years, the question was met with silence, not even bamboo splinters. It wasn't until 2016, when Norway finally distanced itself from the prize's aftermath, that panda talks resumed, and soon after, in 2018, 2 pandas arrived in Oslo. Coincidence not even close. Historians still argue whether these delays were official punishment or just bureaucratic slowdowns. But within diplomatic circles, everyone understood the subtext. You want the pandas, you behave. You don't criticize, you don't lecture. You nod politely and order the sesame buns. These loyalty tests don't always come in the form of panda denials. Sometimes the pandas are the carrot in a much larger negotiation. In 2009, a famous case unfolded when Taiwan received its first 2 pandas, Tuan Tuan and Yuen Yuen. Their names, when combined, mean reunion. Subtle, right, Beijing offered them as a gesture of goodwill during a period of warming cross-strait relations. But critics in Taiwan pointed out what everyone knew: this was not just about animals. It was a political message. Accept the pandas and accept the implied unity. Reject them and you reject more than fluff, you reject a statement of belonging. And this isn't isolated. When countries vote against China in international forums, whether on human rights issues or territorial disputes, they often find their panda requests shelved, delayed, or denied outright. One Eastern European country reportedly had its panda proposal lost in internal review after it supported a UN resolution condemning certain policies. Years passed. The request was never revived. But the inverse also holds true. Want to strengthen trade ties with China? Build a tech partnership. Reassure them after a diplomatic stumble. Bring up pandas. Nothing says we're sorry like a well-funded zoo proposal. And when the panda is approved, it becomes a photo op, not just for the zoo, but for your government. Your head of state appears beside the Chinese ambassador, both holding commemorative bamboo shoots like medieval lords toasting a truce. Let us celebrate this friendship, they say. And everyone claps because no one wants to point out that the panda is chained to $1 million a year lease and a list of off-limit topics. The tension sometimes leaks out in odd ways. A famous incident occurred in 2013 when the UK expressed concern about cyber espionage. Around the same time, discussions about panda breeding at the Edinburgh Zoo mysteriously hit a wall. Chinese experts stopped scheduling visits. Certain forms were delayed. Panda diplomacy, it seems, doesn't always end with a tidy press release. It sometimes just stalls. Quietly, frustratingly. Diplomats call it panda freeze. Not as dramatic as sanction, sure, but just as effective when the message needs to land without making noise. Of course, the public rarely hears this part. They see the pandas, the kids' drawing contests, the birthday cakes shaped like bamboo. They don't see the dinner meetings where a state secretary hesitates before mentioning Hong Kong, or the moment when a minister rehearses a speech 3 times to avoid a single phrase that might spark a panda-related backlash. In this way, pandas operate as emotional leverage. The country that hosts a panda pair becomes emotionally invested, not just the zoo, but the public. Once a panda is in your country, removal becomes nearly unthinkable. It would be a scandal, a national wound. So if Beijing needs to remind you of your place, it doesn't have to withdraw the pandas, it just has to imply they might. That's why zoos tread carefully. That's why diplomats send thank you letters that are practically sonnets. That's why panda parties include a ceremonial nod to China's conservation leadership. Every panda event is a reaffirmation, a loyalty pledge wrapped in smiles and bear costumes. And you, dear listener, if you were a government advisor trying to secure pandas for your zoo, you'd have a checklist that went far beyond animal care. You'd need cultural understanding, strategic language, a knack for pretending an animal lease wasn't a geopolitical handshake. You'd sit through late-night Zoom calls with Chinese liaisons, sip tea that's too floral, and nod earnestly as you promise to uphold the spirit of cross-cultural trust and mutual respect. Because deep down, you'd know you're not just renting bears, you're being measured. And in this quiet, fuzzy evaluation, your country's actions, its votes, its speeches, its trade decisions become part of the scorecard. The bear may nap all day, but it sleeps on a ledger, and every time you renew the lease, you turn the page. You're seated at a mahogany table in a conference room that smells faintly of lemon polish and nervous sweat. To your left, your zoo's finance officer. To your right, someone from the Department of Foreign Affairs who never thought they'd be talking about bamboo import logistics. Across from you, the Chinese delegation, impeccably polite, sipping green tea from porcelain cups that somehow look older than your entire zoo. This isn't just a budget meeting, it's a ritual, a dance. And at the center of it is a bear who couldn't care less as long as the bamboo keeps coming. Welcome to the tangled web of backdoor deals and bamboo bribes, the unseen machinery behind panda diplomacy. Because once the cameras stop rolling and the panda cake is cleared away, what's left is paperwork. And not just simple contracts either. We're talking multi-layered agreements with conservation clauses, import-export codes, breeding contingency plans, and an itemized list of acceptable bamboo species. Panda deals are never just about the animals, they're about what the animals allow. The bear opens the door and everything else slips in behind it. Trade negotiations, investment projects, sister city agreements, academic exchanges. Suddenly everyone wants to be involved. Everyone wants a slice of the panda pie. One lesser-known example comes from Australia. When Adelaide Zoo secured a panda pair in 2009, it wasn't just an animal loan, it was wrapped inside a larger trade package involving mineral exports and agricultural access. At one point, Chinese officials reportedly mentioned bamboo imports in the same breath as wine tariffs. Historians still debate whether these were direct quid pro quos or just parallel developments, but come on, sometimes a wink is as good as a handshake. And yes, there's always bamboo drama. One would think a panda is simple, give bear munches, bamboo, repeat. But no, not all bamboo is created equal. It must be fresh, clean, pesticide-free and preferably grown in climates similar to Sichuan. And this means zoos sometimes have to import it from absurd distances, Hawaii, Costa Rica, even special farms in Florida, just to meet standards. In one bizarre case, a zoo's entire panda application stalled because their proposed bamboo supplier couldn't guarantee delivery during hurricane season. It was like trying to negotiate a spinach contract with a very fussy vegetarian monarch. Then there are the memorandums of understanding, the vague, glossy agreements signed in front of cameras at international forums. These documents often mention things like enhanced mutual understanding through cultural exchange, but everyone in the room knows what it really means. We want the panda, and we're willing to talk about other things to get it. Things like infrastructure projects, like green energy investment, like, say, letting a major Chinese company build a new terminal at your national port. Not always, not officially, but often enough that you start to see a pattern. Critics have called this bamboo diplomacy a subset of soft power, where the animal is the bait and everything else is the hook. Others argue it's just smart politics. After all, the panda is a finite resource. There are fewer than 2,000 in the wild, and only a handful are suitable for international transfer. So why wouldn't China use them strategically? It's no different, they argue, than America using aircraft carriers or Europe using cheese designations. Everyone's got a thing. China just happens to eat 40 pounds of bamboo a day and fall off logs on YouTube. Still, it gets murky, especially when panda deals begin to intersect with opaque financial arrangements. There have been cases where donations to Chinese conservation organizations listed as part of the panda lease agreement were later tied to development funds with political strings. One African nation reportedly received panda offers shortly after agreeing to join a Belt and Road project. Coincidence possibly. But these aren't isolated dots on a map. They form a constellation, one shaped unmistakably like a bear. Even at the local level, things get messy. Zoos must raise enormous amounts of money just to qualify for panda hosting. This sparks aggressive donor campaigns where corporations compete to slap their names on enclosures enrichment programs or even the panda cam. In one awkward case, a fast food chain secured naming rights to a panda play structure until the Chinese side objected to the branding, citing concerns about cultural dignity. Translation: your burger logo isn't going on our bear's jungle gym. Deal with it. Then there's the data. Every panda abroad generates valuable research on behavior, reproduction, illness adaptation. That data must be shared with China under strict terms. Some zoologists have complained that certain findings were pre-edited before publication, especially if the results clashed with approved narratives about conservation success. One American researcher described the process as scientific karaoke. You're technically singing, but someone else picks the song. But the weirdest stories, they always come from people caught in the middle, like the translator who was told not to mention Taiwan during a press conference, or the logistics manager who had to sign a confidentiality agreement before loading bamboo into a freight container, or the marketing intern who got a panicked call from someone in Beijing because a promotional panda cartoon had accidentally used the wrong flag in the background. And yet, despite the secrecy and the red tape and the strategic chessboard, people still chase the panda dream. Zoos still build those expensive enclosures. Cities still compete to host them, because a panda isn't just an animal, it's a magnet for funding, for tourism, for legitimacy. If your zoo gets a panda, it's not just a win for your animal program, it's a nod from the world's second largest economy. It means you've been seen, you've been chosen, you've been weighed and found sufficiently aligned. So the deals go on. Behind the fanfare, beneath the panda cakes and press photos, diplomats and zoo directors sit down with legal teams and bamboo suppliers and draw up contracts that are equal parts conservation plan and foreign policy gambit, all for an animal that at this very moment is probably asleep on its back, with one leg sticking up like a broken umbrella. You're standing in front of a glass enclosure, watching a panda scratch its belly with the sort of lazy precision usually reserved for retired jazz musicians. Behind you, a cluster of tourists murmurs appreciatively, cameras clicking like applause. But while they marvel at the creature's slow-motion charisma, you start to wonder, how much did this cost? Not just in dollars, but in diplomacy, because once the panda is settled in, and the banners are taken down, and the last of the panda cupcakes are sold, someone has to pay the bill, and it turns out it's not just about bear chow. On the surface, the cost of a panda lease is shockingly high. The going rate, around $1 million per year per pair. Paid directly to the China Wildlife Conservation Association, this fee is officially described as a contribution to panda conservation efforts in China. But that's just the beginning. Host zoos also commit to building state-of-the-art facilities, often $10 to $30 million projects. and must maintain a steady supply of fresh, certified bamboo. On top of that are transportation costs, insurance, veterinary staff, breeding specialists, and Chinese liaisons stationed at the zoo for regular check-ins. The real annual cost of hosting pandas, easily $2 to $3 million per year. So, why do it? Because pandas are soft power with claws, not dangerous ones, but influential ones. They generate goodwill headlines and crowds. Within weeks of a panda arrival, zoo attendance can spike by 20 to 40%. Donor revenue increases. Local businesses sell panda-themed snacks and merchandise. Hotels near the zoo suddenly offer black and white packages for families. It becomes an entire ecosystem of fuzzy profitability. But the financial return is just part of the story. The political return is subtler and in some ways more valuable. When a country receives pandas, it sends a quiet message to the world: we're on good terms with China. This signaling is especially useful for countries navigating tense global waters. It doesn't have the noise of trade deals or defense treaties, no dramatic headlines, just a bear, sitting, eating, smiling faintly as it becomes the literal embodiment of bilateral success. Historians still argue whether this strategy yields real political benefits or just good PR. Some insist it's largely symbolic window dressing on a diplomatic showroom floor. Others claim it opens doors, paves roads, and lubricates the gears of government-to-government interaction. Whatever the truth, few countries are willing to walk away from the opportunity. After all, pandas are a prestige project. If your capital city has pandas, it means you matter at least a little more than the one that doesn't. China, of course, understands this calculus perfectly. That's why they carefully limit the number of pandas available for lease. That's why they choose recipients with precision. They don't give them to every country. They give them to countries they want to influence, reward, or deepen ties with. And they give them at moments that matter, after major trade summits, after diplomatic breakthroughs, after visits from heads of state. The panda is a punctuation mark to a paragraph that hasn't even been spoken aloud. Take the case of the Netherlands. In 2017, after years of courtship, the Dutch finally received a panda pair, Wu Wen and Xing Ya. The announcement came shortly after a flurry of Dutch-Chinese trade discussions and a string of high-profile visits. The Dutch media celebrated. The pandas were flown in on a specially chartered aircraft, complete with their own security detail and a panda-themed livery. A Dutch brewery even released a commemorative beer. The message was clear: this wasn't just about the bears. This was a public symbol of private progress. Even corporations have gotten in on the act. In several cases, multinational companies headquartered in panda-hosting cities have seen smoother relations with Chinese partners. Some even sponsor panda programs in exchange for networking opportunities with Chinese officials. It's soft lobbying by association. A company executive once joked, "If the panda likes you, maybe the trade minister will too." Only half joking. There are also less tangible returns: educational exchange programs, science partnerships, student visa cooperation, tourism growth. When a panda arrives, it doesn't just attract families, it attracts academics, journalists, and cultural envoys. You suddenly have an excuse to host cross-cultural festivals, exhibit Chinese art, teach Mandarin in local schools. The panda becomes a nucleus for soft diplomacy with tendrils reaching far beyond the zoo gates. But this doesn't come without expectations. China watches carefully. If a zoo director makes an unsanctioned comment in an interview, it may affect renewal discussions. If a politician criticizes Beijing too loudly, the panda program might suffer. In one case, a zoo's proposed expansion was mysteriously paused after a government agency made a bold public statement about Hong Kong. Nothing was said, nothing had to be. The message was understood. There's also a cultural obligation. Hosting pandas means honoring Chinese holidays, traditions, and conservation philosophies. Many zoos now hold Lunar New Year events complete with red lanterns, calligraphy workshops, and themed enrichment activities for the pandas. And while that may seem like light-hearted fun, it's also part of the deal. Pandas are not just animals, they're ambassadors. And hosting them means treating their home culture with reverence. In this way, pandas are less like rented exhibits and more like envoys under bamboo diplomacy. Their presence is a daily reminder of a much larger relationship. And unlike an ambassador, a panda won't say anything controversial. It won't walk out of a press conference. It won't forget the talking points. It just sits there. A quiet, charismatic cipher. But that silence speaks volumes. Every time a panda rolls over or waves a paw or sneezes on cue, it invites affection, not just for itself, but for the country it represents. That affection, multiplied across millions of visitors, becomes influence. Influence without pressure. Trust without threat. Power with plush fur. So yes, pandas are expensive. Yes, the contracts are dense and the politics are denser. But ask any zoo director if it's worth it, and you'll see the answer in their eyes. Because when a panda blinks slowly at a child leaning over the railing, there's a kind of magic that no other animal can replicate. A magic that China has harnessed, curated and exported one sleepy shipment at a time. You're watching a panda cub roll lazily down a soft hill of mulch, its fur catching flecks of sunlight as it tumbles into a clumsy heap. The crowd gasps, half concern, half delight. A zookeeper chuckles. He's fine, they say. But behind the scenes, a very different process is already underway, the countdown to departure. Because that adorable fluffball born just 2 years ago in your country's most popular zoo doesn't get to stay. No matter how many visitors it brings, no matter how many children consider it a lifelong friend, by contract and custom the cub must be sent back to China. It's a hard truth that surprises many. The cub was born here, they say. It's part of us. But China's stance is non-negotiable. All pandas, including their offspring, are on loan, and any cubs born overseas are Chinese nationals due for repatriation by age 4. That's the rule. No exceptions. So why does this happen, you wonder? The answer is layered. On paper, the rationale is genetic integrity and conservation coordination. Centralized breeding facilities in Chengdu and Wolong are better equipped, China says, to manage lineage, prevent inbreeding, and ensure long-term survival. With fewer than 2,000 pandas in the wild and a few hundred more in captivity, bloodlines matter. Precision matters. A mating mistake in Berlin could ripple into the future of the species. But underneath this conservation logic lies something more powerful, a symbolic control. By reclaiming every cub, China maintains permanent authorship of the panda narrative. Even if a cub is born in San Diego, raised by American hands, featured in US headlines, its return becomes a diplomatic reminder this is still our treasure. It's a masterstroke in soft power, one that ensures pandas abroad never fully become local. They remain quite literally foreign policy on 4 paws. Historians still debate whether this approach strengthens global conservation or weakens local engagement. Some argue that returning the cubs too early disrupts valuable long-term research. Others counter that it keeps China's efforts unified, allowing it to set the pace and direction of the global panda program. Either way, there's no room for negotiation. Cubs go back. That's the rule. And this repatriation, it isn't subtle, it's theatrical. In many cases, the farewell is publicized like a celebrity send-off. Farewell ceremonies are held, children draw goodbye cards, social media hashtags trend, newspapers run retrospectives on the cub's milestones: first sneeze, first bamboo chew, first tree climb. Gift shops offer commemorative mugs, safe journey bow bow. And somewhere in the background, a zookeeper quietly updates the travel manifest: crate weight sedation, schedule in-flight feeding routine. The actual transport is a feat of logistical overkill. The panda is placed in a climate-controlled crate, often lined with bamboo for comfort and familiarity. A flight crew is briefed on emergency procedures. Chinese veterinary staff travel with the cub. Upon arrival in China, a small reception is usually held, with flowers, banners and camera crews waiting at the tarmac. It's not just a homecoming, it's a home claiming. And here's the twist. Sometimes the cub doesn't adjust easily. Born abroad, raised in a different climate, used to different enrichment toys and human voices, it arrives in China and finds the bamboo tastes different, the staff smells different, the dialects are foreign. In one reported case, a panda born in France refused to respond to Chinese commands for weeks, prompting trainers to use gentle French phrases while transitioning it into its new routine. You can't make this up. Globalization in bare form. Then there's the matter of names. The cub may have a Western nickname, a public persona, but once in China, it sometimes receives a new designation, a Chinese name, often rooted in tradition or selected for auspicious meaning. A fresh identity to match its official role in the national breeding plan, so while you remember it as Fluffy or Tiny Bao China, registers it under something like Longqiang or Huaxiang. Its symbolic reclamation through renaming. This process, though routine now, wasn't always so. In the early decades of panda diplomacy, cubs born abroad were occasionally retained for longer periods or even treated as informal gifts. But as China's influence grew and as the panda program became more formalized, these practices tightened. Contracts became stricter, returns became mandatory. Today there are precise deadlines tracked and enforced. In rare cases of delay, embassies are notified. Entire diplomatic conversations have been initiated over scheduling a panda flight. And while most countries comply without issue, some zoos have pushed back quietly, not in defiance but in grief. They ask for extensions, they propose shared custody, they offer to fund joint breeding research in exchange for extra years. But the answer is almost always the same: thank you for your cooperation. The panda must come home. There's a bittersweet poetry to it all. The panda, born far from the misty mountains of Sichuan, leaves behind a life it never chose, a crowd of daily admirers, a team of devoted handlers, a city that treats it like royalty. And yet it returns not as a stranger, but as a prodigal diplomat. It leaves one spotlight only to enter another. And for the host country, the panda's departure leaves a hole. Not just in the enclosure, but in the public heart. Attendance dips, zoo morale wavers, local papers run quiet laments. But the process itself, the act of returning the cub, cements the relationship. It closes a circle. It proves, paradoxically, that the system works, the lease ends, the trust is honored, and the door remains open for future bears. So the next time you hear about a panda cub's flight back to China, know that it's not just a logistical procedure, it's an international ritual, a changing of the fur-covered guard, a reminder that while pandas may seem to belong to the world, they ultimately go home not because they're forced, but because that's the design. Every panda abroad is part of a larger story, and every cub that returns, it turns the page. You're flipping through headlines, maybe sipping your morning tea, when you catch a curious line buried in the international section, "Panda talk stalled amid diplomatic tensions." It's vague, unsourced, easy to skip. But if you've been paying attention, you know what that really means. Someone just got snubbed. Because in the realm of panda diplomacy, sometimes the loudest message comes from not getting a bear. These absences sting, especially when a neighboring country gets one. You can almost hear the sighs in government offices, the quiet grumbles in foreign affairs committees. Because being left off the panda list isn't just about missing out on a cute animal. It's a public reminder that your relationship with China isn't quite warm enough. Not hostile, maybe, but cool, cautious, not cuddly. Take Japan, for instance. Despite being one of China's closest neighbors and largest trade partners, it has a complicated panda timeline. Yes, Ueno Zoo in Tokyo has long hosted pandas, beginning in the early 1970s after diplomatic normalization. But for years afterward, securing new pandas or renewing leases wasn't automatic. Each negotiation was a tightly wrapped diplomatic package subject to the slightest tremor in political relations. When tensions flared over disputed islands in the East China Sea, those rocky outcrops nobody lives on, but everyone argues over, panda discussions went ice cold. Protests erupted in both countries, diplomatic cables grew cautious, and panda exchanges paused. Entire breeding proposals were shelved mid-discussion. One Tokyo-based official even joked, "At this point we'd be lucky if they sent us a panda keychain." Historians still argue whether such pauses were official policy or unofficial chill. China never says outright you've lost bear privileges, they simply let the process stall. Let the emails go unanswered. Let the bamboo rot quietly on the loading dock. And it works. The absence is deafening. When a country that once had pandas suddenly doesn't, even for a few years, it feels like a downgrade in trust, a subtraction from the friendship meter. Even allies aren't immune. Germany, the UK, Canada. They've all faced moments where their panda negotiations slowed unexpectedly often after their governments made public statements about human rights, Hong Kong or Tibet. In each case, the Chinese government maintained polite silence, but zoo directors reading between the lines began sweating through their safari vests. And then there are the hopefuls, the countries who want pandas but never get them. Some make their interest known quietly behind closed doors. Others go public, hoping a little press will help nudge things along. We have the habitat, they insist. We've grown the bamboo, we've named the enclosure. But unless the diplomatic climate is favorable, none of it matters. Without a nod from Beijing, all the preparation in the world won't get you a bear. One such case, India. Despite its size, proximity, and global prominence, India has never received a panda. Not one. It's tried. Multiple times. But Sino-Indian relations have always been tinged with military tension and a mutual mistrust. Border disputes in the Himalayas. Competing regional interests. And a lingering sense of rivalry. Pandas, it seems, do not cross contested borders. And so for all its might, India remains pandaless, appointed a mission, noted by scholars and diplomats alike. The snubs aren't always so dramatic. Sometimes they're quieter, more bureaucratic. A renewal that gets delayed. A promised cub that never materializes. A proposal that's still under internal review for months, then years. One zoo director in Europe described the process like this. It's not that they say no, they just never say yes. Still, the symbolism resonates. A missing panda becomes a mirror of diplomatic distance, and the public often senses it even if they can't articulate why. They ask, why don't we have pandas anymore? And behind every press release about conservation priorities or facility upgrades, there's an unspoken answer, because something changed. This uncertainty has made zoos increasingly careful. They avoid controversy, they edit press materials, they train spokespeople to speak like diplomats. One zoo even scrapped a panda-themed art exhibit because a single sculpture meant to depict environmental stress was deemed too politically abstract. No one wanted to take the risk. But sometimes the damage has already been done. In one memorable case, a zoo's social media account liked a political post deemed sensitive by Chinese authorities. Within days, communication slowed, invitations were rescinded, the breeding consultation was rescheduled indefinitely. A bear never arrived. The staff quietly archived the panda signage they had spent 6 months designing. And yet, for all the tension, for all the silent slights and diplomatic minefields, countries still chase the panda dream, because absence, after all, is not the end. It's a pause, a puzzle to be solved, a void that invites repair. And when the bears return, because they often do, it feels like a public thaw, like a long exhale. So yes, when a country loses its pandas or waits endlessly for a pair that never comes, it may feel like a small thing, just 2 bears after all. But beneath that silence is a rich and complicated story, a story of how something soft and slow and deeply unbothered has become the world's most exclusive membership badge. Because in panda diplomacy, it's not just the presence that matters, it's the absence, the stillness where the bear used to be, the quiet question that hovers in every zoo without pandas. Why not us? What did we do wrong? And sometimes the answer is whispered not in press conferences, but in corridors, in meetings, in the pauses between handshakes. You lean over the railing at a quiet French zoo and see the panda sprawled in a blissful eucalyptus-scented nap. A child beside you whispers, "What's his name?" And you catch a flicker of tension in the volunteer's face before she smiles. "He's called Yuan Meng," she says. But what she doesn't say is this naming him was a mess. Because even something as seemingly harmless as a name can erupt into controversy when it comes to panda diplomacy. In 2017, France welcomed its first panda cub born at Beauval Zoo, with all the fanfare you'd expect: media helicopters, front-page headlines, and national joy. President Emmanuel Macron even referenced it during diplomatic visits to China. But then came the naming. As with every panda abroad, the final name needed to be approved by Beijing. This wasn't symbolic, it was written into the agreement. And this time, the naming turned into a miniature international headache. The zoo had hoped for something that reflected Franco-Chinese friendship, something bicultural. But Chinese officials favored a name grounded in traditional values and hopeful meaning. Eventually, they settled on Yuan Meng, meaning the realization of a dream. Sweet right shore. Except that the French public didn't get a say. Despite thousands of locals voting in a contest, the final decision came from the Chinese embassy. The public's top picks were quietly shelved. The message was clear: you can host the bear, but we write the story. It wasn't the first time. Historians still argue over which naming controversies were genuine cultural misunderstandings and which were strategic reminders of ownership. In one American case, a zoo encouraged the public to suggest fun, catchy names. Someone because the internet is what it is submitted Panda, McPandaface. It won the online vote. China was not amused. The zoo quietly overrode the vote, choosing a more dignified approved name. Crisis averted. Barely. Then there was the case in Thailand where a naming contest for a newborn panda resulted in thousands of entries, many referencing Thai royalty or pop culture figures. The Chinese committee rejected them all. The final name, Lin Ping, was selected for its linguistic harmony with Chinese panda tradition. This sparked complaints on Thai radio, where callers joked that next time they should just tell us the name in advance. Because let's face it, when diplomacy is involved, democracy takes a back seat. Sometimes it's not just names. Even birthday parties can become a matter of protocol. In Japan, when a panda cub turned 1, the zoo wanted to host a family-themed celebration featuring local musicians and food stalls. Chinese officials suggested a more formal ceremony with traditional calligraphy, symbolic bamboo offerings, and a speech about conservation cooperation. The compromise was a weird hybrid music from a local boy band followed by a monk-led ceremony under Chinese lanterns. The panda predictably slept through the whole thing. There have even been disputes over costume characters. One zoo in Europe designed a dancing panda mascot to perform at educational events, but after a visiting delegation saw it trip over its costume paws and tumble into a hot dog stand, the idea was scrapped. It dishonors the dignity of the animal, said one Chinese official. Pandas should not be clowns. The zoo apologized. The mascot was retired. And somewhere, a man in a sweaty panda suit quietly updated his resume. Of course, the push and pull over presentation goes beyond parties. There's also architecture. Zoos sometimes spend millions designing panda pavilions meant to evoke Chinese culture, but interpretations vary. One American zoo built an enclosure with curved red roofs and stylized dragons. Chinese critics called it theme park kitsch. Another tried a minimalist bamboo forest. Too sparse, said reviewers. Pandas need serenity, not Scandinavian feng shui. Everyone's an expert when it comes to what a panda wants. These disagreements may sound petty. They're not. They reveal the deeper tension at the heart of panda diplomacy, whose story is being told. The host country wants to celebrate a rare, adorable animal that boosts tourism and national pride. China wants to reinforce its narrative, a legacy of stewardship, generosity, and cultural richness, and both want to do it on their own terms. Even scientific communication gets caught in the middle. Research papers involving panda behavior must be co-approved. Breeding announcements are sometimes embargoed until Chinese media is prepared to release their version. One European scientist working with pandas described the publication process as walking through a bamboo maze while blindfolded and carrying eggs. Translation: slow, delicate, and filled with strange obstacles. Yet somehow the cooperation continues, because even with the occasional conflict over mascots and menu items, the core relationship remains strong. Pandas are too important, too symbolic, too beloved for minor scandals to derail the whole affair. And if tensions flare up, a formal apology, a ceremonial fruit basket, and a donation to panda conservation usually smooth things over. Still, the naming of a panda cub has now become a diplomatic micro-event. Journalists dig into the backstory, activists analyze the political messaging, talk shows debate pronunciation, Entire op-eds are written about what a name means in the context of bilateral ties. It's adorable theatre, but it's also real diplomacy dressed in fluff. So the next time you hear that a new panda was born in Madrid or Melbourne or Montreal, don't just ask, what's its name? Ask who chose it. Ask what it means. Ask what it says. Not about the bear, but about the people shaking hands above its sleepy little head. Because even as the panda naps, the conversation continues. Every syllable of its name, every brushstroke on the sign above its den, every birthday cake flavor, each one is a small performance in a very long, very polite global drama. You watch the panda stretch lazily under the dappled shade of its enclosure, its paw flopping over its eyes like a celebrity dodging the paparazzi. It's hard to imagine this sleepy creature igniting debate, but believe it or not, there's a growing rift in the conservation world, a quiet, passionate disagreement among experts, activists, and ethicists. Because while pandas have long been treated as ambassadors of goodwill, a new question is echoing through environmental conferences and behind closed doors at NGOs. Do panda rentals actually help conservation, or do they just help China? It's a difficult conversation, and one that's only become louder as global awareness around animal ethics and soft power diplomacy has grown. The panda, once a symbol of unity, now sits at the center of a deeper concern. Is this iconic species being used more for image management than environmental impact? Let's start with the basic math. The lease fees, as we've mentioned, can total tens of millions over a panda's lifetime abroad. China says that money goes directly into panda conservation and habitat restoration in Sichuan and neighboring provinces. And indeed, some of it does. Protected forest zones have expanded. Breeding centers in Chengdu and Wolong are some of the most advanced in the world. China has made undeniable progress reclassifying the panda from endangered to vulnerable in 2021. But critics point out that the numbers don't always add up. A portion of those funds is wrapped in bureaucracy. Another chunk disappears into state-run conservation departments with little public accounting. Historians still argue whether the panda program has been more effective at saving pandas or promoting China's global brand. And that's not a rhetorical flourish, it's a legitimate, ongoing debate in environmental circles. There's also the matter of allocation versus symbolism. Conservationists from other parts of the world quietly grumble that pandas get too much attention. Entire species of birds, amphibians, and insects are quietly going extinct without fanfare, while one panda's sneeze gets front-page coverage. As one biologist put it, a single black and white furball eats up the PR budget for 40 less cute animals that are just as endangered. The irony is not lost on scientists working in regions like the Amazon or the Congo Basin, where ecosystems are collapsing and funding is scarce. They see panda diplomacy not as a model, but as a cautionary tale, proof that charisma bias in conservation can skew priorities. When governments and zoos spend tens of millions on pandas, what does that say about the animals that don't fit neatly into cartoon plush form? Then there's the question of ethics. More and more, the public is beginning to question whether these long-distance leases, no matter how well regulated, are appropriate. Is it really ethical to treat a near-threatened species as a diplomatic token, shuttling them thousands of miles into artificial habitats under strict ownership clauses? Animal rights groups have raised concerns. Some have pointed to pandas showing signs of stress, listlessness, or anxiety during adaptation. Others have flagged the unnatural reproductive pressure placed on pandas in captivity-timed mating attempts, hormonal injections, and around-the-clock surveillance. One particular incident involving a female panda subjected to multiple unsuccessful breeding attempts in a single season led to a small protest outside a European zoo. The signs read, "She's not a diplomat, she's a bear. Simple, direct, awkwardly poetic." And yet the other side of the debate is just as passionate. Panda defenders argue that without this international attention, the species might have disappeared by now. The global focus, they say, is what saved the panda, what turned it from a sad symbol of extinction into a case study in recovery. They point to the expanded forest corridors, the return of bamboo growth, the successful rewilding of some captive-born pandas. It's not perfect, they admit, but it's progress. And in a world of ecological bad news, the panda story remains one of the few good ones. There's also the cultural factor. For China, the panda is more than an animal. It's a national symbol. Hosting a panda is seen as a diplomatic trust exercise. Returning a cub is seen as an act of respect. Critics who ignore this, defenders argue, are imposing Western conservation frameworks onto a very Chinese model, one that blends diplomacy culture and environmental stewardship into a single policy. Still, not everyone is convinced. Even within China, there's growing scrutiny over the balance between symbolism and substance. Chinese environmental scholars have published essays questioning whether global panda diplomacy does enough to protect wild populations versus just the celebrity zoo circuit. Some have called for more direct international collaboration, more transparency, and more equitable data sharing with foreign zoos. Others suggest that China may be over-leveraging the panda, risking its credibility if the diplomacy begins to feel too transactional. It's a tightrope walk. Too much showmanship and the program looks manipulative. Too little transparency and it invites suspicion. Too much control and host countries feel uneasy. Too much flexibility and China loses narrative authority. Everyone involved knows this. That's why panda diplomacy is so carefully stage-managed, from the crate design to the press release. And yet, amid all this tension, the pandas themselves go on doing what they've always done, munching bamboo, climbing, awkwardly stealing hearts. They are innocent of the structures built around them, unaware that their every sneeze or stretch might spark a tweet, an op-ed, or a diplomatic comment thread. So where does that leave us? Somewhere between admiration and uncertainty, between conservation and spectacle, between a sleepy bear with a stick of bamboo and a global system that treats that bear as both ambassador and artifact. And the truth, both sides of the argument are probably right. Panda diplomacy has saved the species, and yes, it's also used it. The question now is whether this model can evolve, whether it can be reshaped into something that protects not just the panda, but the entire ecosystem it represents, whether we can move from symbolism to sustainability. That's the real legacy at stake. And in the meantime, the panda rolls over, scratches its belly and falls asleep again, oblivious maybe, but not insignificant. You sit quietly, blinking at the soft glow of your screen, watching a Panda Cam live stream from a zoo halfway across the world. It's night there too. The enclosure is dim, lit only by moonlight and the dull hum of security lights. The panda lies motionless, breathing slow, draped like a throw blanket over a tree stump. And in this moment, simple, still and silent, it's hard not to wonder, how long can this last? Will panda diplomacy continue forever? Or are we nearing the end of an era where trust was measured in fur and bamboo? It's a question many are now asking because the world is changing. Climate change, geopolitical shifts, and new diplomatic strategies are reshaping everything, including how countries express friendship. And while the panda once reigned supreme as the most charming soft power tool ever deployed, its future as a diplomatic currency is suddenly less certain. Part of this has to do with the panda's evolving symbolism. For decades it represented innocence, peace, conservation, and unity. But in recent years that image has grown more complex. Global perceptions of China have shifted. What was once seen as a benevolent gift now raises eyebrows. What was once an adorable gesture of goodwill now invites scrutiny. Critics now ask, is the panda a symbol of friendship or a velvet-wrapped obligation? Host countries are beginning to reassess their panda programs. Some are weighing the cost, others are questioning the politics. The United States, long home to several beloved panda pairs, has seen leases lapse in recent years with no clear renewal in sight. The National Zoo's pandas Meishang Tiantian and their cub Xiaoqi departed in 2023 after 2 decades in Washington, D.C. There were ceremonies, tears, and live farewell coverage on national news, but no promises of return. It felt like a curtain call, and America isn't alone. Other nations have begun to express discomfort with the unspoken expectations attached to panda leases. Some worry that continuing the arrangement signals political alignment they're no longer comfortable displaying. Others simply can't justify the cost when budgets tighten and priorities shift. A panda is still beloved But love has become expensive and complicated. Historians still argue whether these changes reflect a broader decline in soft diplomacy or just a temporary freeze. Is panda diplomacy over or just pausing? Will another generation of fluffy ambassadors arrive, or will zoos increasingly focus on native species and ethical exhibits? No one knows for sure. But the trend is unmistakable. The era of automatic panda awe is fading. Even China seems to be adapting. While panda loans still happen, they're now surrounded by greater formality and tighter control. The message is subtle but clear. These animals are not just cuddly representatives. They are national assets, sent only under conditions of mutual benefit and cultural respect, and that's fair. But it changes the tone. The panda becomes less of a warm gesture and more of a strategic transaction. And yet, the magic isn't gone. Because wherever they go, pandas still draw crowds, still make children point and squeal, still reduce tired adults to delighted onlookers, phone cameras held high, hearts slightly melted. That power, that universal disarming charm, remains untouched by geopolitics. And perhaps that's why the panda has lasted this long, because it speaks in a language no press briefing can capture. It says, look, breathe, smile, we're not so different. And in a time when difference defines so much of global discourse, that message still carries weight. Even in places that no longer host pandas, the memory of them lingers. Former panda exhibits become shrines. Visitors leave drawings, notes, soft toys. Zoos keep the signage up just in case. And somewhere in the distance, a child asks their parent, will they ever come back? Maybe they will, or maybe the next chapter of diplomatic trust will be written through something else entirely. Joint climate research, shared vaccine programs, cultural exchanges driven by technology, not fur. But no matter what comes next, the panda will always be there in our memories, in our media, in our plush toy piles, reminding us that even the world's biggest, loudest powers once chose to speak in soft, furry whispers. And in that sense, panda diplomacy has already succeeded. It's shown us that trust doesn't always need to be shouted, that sometimes the most powerful symbol of international partnership is not a treaty or a warship or a speech, but a sleepy bear sitting on its bottom eating lunch for 3 hours straight without blinking. So now, as the lights dim and the panda settles into another nap in a forest somewhere, or maybe a zoo under the care of a team who knows every twitch of its ears, you begin to slow your breathing too. The world so loud with headlines and urgency fades into the soft hush of rustling bamboo and distant laughter of children outside the exhibit gates. The panda, unaware of all this meaning we've layered upon it, simply exhales, curls into a gentle heap, and drifts off. It doesn't care who wrote the agreement, who signed the papers, who debated its name. It sleeps because it is safe, because someone cared enough to build a place where it could rest. And that, in the end, is all most creatures want. Let your mind drift with it now. Picture that calm. The quiet warmth of fur under dappled light. The rhythmic chew of bamboo, steady and soothing like the ticking of a clock. You can finally stop watching. The story has slowed. The questions have softened. The symbols have paused. And all that's left is a peaceful rumbling breath in the dark. You don't need to remember the details now. You don't need to solve the puzzle or take a side. Just rest. The panda will keep watch a little longer. It always has.